Ashley Lowe, the Chief Executive Officer at Lakeshore Legal Aid, and I'm filming this presentation in collaboration with the Joseph Project about trauma-informed practice. And so you may be asking yourself, why do we need to know about trauma-informed practice? Why do I need to know that in addition to all the other things I know as a lawyer? Well, the short answer is so many of our clients, particularly those who are survivors of trafficking, are trauma survivors as well. And we need to have the tools to help represent them in the best possible way. So what are the key elements of a trauma-informed practice? They are being aware of the presence of trauma. We're going to talk today about identifying the things that look like trauma when trauma is being exhibited, so you know that it's there. And then we're going to talk about ways that you can address it. Instead of fighting against the elements of trauma, working with it, understanding and getting in front of those things, so you have a lot of tools in your toolbox in order to help victims of trauma and help your advocacy as well. So it's important to start off with a definition of trauma. The DSM tells us that trauma happens when a person is confronted with a death, threatened death, actual or threatened serious injury, or actual or threatened sexual violence, either a direct exposure, witnessing the exposure, or indirectly by hearing about a close relative or close friend who is exposed to trauma. And as you can see, that mirrors directly with the definition of human trafficking, which is power, violence, or coercion used to control victims for forced labor or commercial sex acts. So power, violence, coercion, that creates trauma. And the common tactics of traffickers: physical abuse, threats of abuse, rape, and sexual violence. Again, the kinds of things that cause trauma. And so we know that the clients that you are working with in the Joseph Project, many of them will be survivors of trauma. So it's important to start with the neurobiology of trauma and the behavior and what that means. So as you know, our bodies had to develop these ways to fight against danger and to create a way of getting to safety. And so we have this automatic neurobiological response that happens in our brains. We don't have to do anything. It's not the prefrontal cortex, but it's really that primitive brain that is telling our body to release these neurochemicals. And when they do, then we have our heartbeat speeds up and we're able to run faster and get away from any threats that could be happening. So that's a biological response that happens when we're in danger. And this neurobiological response, this has an impact on so many parts of a person. It impacts their cognitive function. It impacts their emotional well-being, their physical well-being. One of the things it has a huge impact on is memory. So if you think about those chemicals, those neurochemical environment that got shot into protecting against this trauma, that has an impact on the way that memories are able to implant in the survivor's brain. So normally, our memories come in and they're nice and orderly, but the traumatized person may not be able to implant those memories so neatly. And when they go to retrieve those memories, they don't come out in a nice chronological way. So some things may be really intense. There might be, your client might say, I can draw this picture of the space where the trauma might have happened, where an abuse had occurred, but not see the abuser's face. Because that's the way their brain implanted those memories. Something's really tight, something's really fuzzy and unclear. And when they unfold in a little bit of a messy way. And also, events and memories can kind of evolve over time so that they come out over time. So you may meet with a client and they tell you their whole story, and the next time you meet with them, maybe a few weeks later, another part of that story comes out. For lawyers who think that possibly people are lying when they don't tell the same story 2 times in a row, that's something to watch for on trauma, because it's not because your client necessarily was keeping something from you. They just might not have remembered that piece at all of their story, and it's now new to them, and they're sharing it with you as it comes up. I think it's useful to think of memories in terms of Post-it notes. So if you write each element of a story on a Post-it note, for me and my lawyer non-traumatic brain, I would put them in a nice orderly way. I would say, I got up, I took a shower, I went to work, I went to court, and all those things fold out neatly. But for a survivor of trauma, theirs is more like a big board filled with Post-it notes, all in a mess. And like you threw those Post-it notes and they just stuck anywhere. And when they try to tell you that story, they're grabbing one and another and another. And it's not neat. There is nothing neat or clean about it, but the trauma survivor is doing the best that they can to communicate what's happened. So when you think of the post-trauma brain, it's a little bit like that primitive brain. It's a seeing, feeling, but not speaking brain. So when your client is trying to tell the story, they may be flooded with visions of experiences they have lived, of times that they were traumatized, and they're seeing those images. And they're feeling those same feelings that they might have felt at the time they were being traumatized. But their brain is in that primitive brain, and they don't have the words necessarily to articulate what those feelings are and what those images are. And so you might get kind of a blank stare or looking off into space. That's not because they're not paying attention or that they're not engaged. That's what their brain is experiencing, and they really don't have the words to share and communicate it in a way that's logical for those who are not experiencing trauma. So trauma has a big impact on behavior. And what you may see in your clients is a wide range of behaviors that would be an indication that trauma is present. You might see that your client is very much in distress. They're aggravated, they're agitated, or on the other hand, they might look very flat and have no affect. And I think before I really understood much about the neurobiology of trauma, what I assumed is that people should be agitated and upset when they were telling me a story. And if they were flat, that meant it wasn't true, or there was, it just wasn't an accurate reflection of what was happening. But there's nothing true in that. People reflect trauma differently, and some are agitated and some are flat. Some are angry and distressed. Sometimes people are paranoid, and sometimes people are passive and just kind of mute. And all those things could be a reflection of the existence of trauma. So when you're looking at somebody and you're doing an interview, what you may see is a story that doesn't unfold in a neat, orderly, chronological way. Maybe your client is agitated, maybe they have a flat affect, maybe they're very distraught. In any event, it doesn't seem like they may be telling you the whole story, but that's their trauma. And so how do you work with that? First and foremost, allow the client to allow the control of the narrative. So ask some open-ended, broad questions and let them talk through in the way that seems natural. Don't do what seems natural to lawyers, which is try to get things into an orderly way. I often take notes and just take as many notes as I can and then go back and order them myself later on, because if you keep asking questions and trying to stop the flow, the client will have a hard time telling you the full story, and you'll lose a lot of that. Also, nonverbal cues. Be sure and lean into your client. Listen to what they're saying. Nod, every now and then you can say, I hear you saying this. How'd that make you feel? What happened next? Encouraging them along. But avoid the cross-examination style of questioning. But wait, let me tell you, that's not how I heard it before. That's not going to be the best way to get the story from your client. Let it unfold naturally. Also, allow for breaks. Telling a traumatizing story is not an easy thing to do. And you need to give your client the space to say to you, hey, I need to take a break. Start off your interview saying, when it happens, tell me, and we'll take a break. It's often very helpful for a client to get up, walk around the building, go outside, and regroup and come back. Sometimes that won't be possible. Sometimes you'll need to just call it a day and come back another day to finish up the interview, because it's just too traumatic for your client to go through it. Another thing you may see is what feels like an unreliable client. Maybe the client doesn't call you back. They don't bring you the documents that you've asked for 100 times. They don't show up to court. They miss meetings with you. And that is also an indication that there might be trauma. So tools that you can use, work with that traumatized brain and know that you need to help them with retention and their memory. Give them information in a variety of ways. So when you're meeting with somebody, hey, remember, next week you're going to bring me this packet of forms that I've asked you to fill out. Then send them an email or a letter that says the same thing. Remember, we talked about A, B, and C. I'm going to do this. You're going to do this. Here's the date. This is a place where texting is your friend. A little nudge here and there doesn't hurt to say, just a reminder, we're going to meet tomorrow. I'm looking forward to it. Here's the address. Here's the place. Just recognizing that your client, maybe pre-trauma, could have had all that in their head and worked fine. But post-trauma, their brain is not able to hold all that in and do something useful with it. So give them a crutch. Give them some help. Another thing that's common with survivors of trauma is unrealistic expectations of the justice system. First of all, your client may feel like you're all in cahoots. The lawyers, the judges, the whole system is designed to exclude the people who don't speak the jargon of the legal system. And that's true for anybody who's not a lawyer, but for survivors of trauma who've been manipulated by a trafficker and really feels excluded, this can be made even worse. So make sure you call that out. Make sure you talk about the fact that I'm going to be your guide. I'm going to take you through this. And I'm not going to get sucked into the manipulation of this particular abuser or batterer or trafficker. I see what they're doing, and I'm not buying into it. Another thing that survivors of trauma often see is a hope that the justice system will solve their problems, will really provide justice. And sometimes that's just not true. Sometimes the legal matter that you're representing the client in, there is no great epiphany where the judge will say, you are right and they are wrong. That might just not happen. It might even be true that your client is going to get criticized by the court. Maybe they are self-medicating due to their trauma and they're using drugs, or they have done that in the past. And the judge knows that, and the judge has an opinion about that, and it's going to look bad. You need to make sure you let your client know. That is a reality of the justice system. There are opinions. They're not necessarily your opinion, but they're there. And so it's important that the client understands the lay of the land. We call this sharing the compassionate truth, setting realistic expectations and explaining what you want from the justice system might not be possible. But I'm going to do the very best that I can to get you the result that you want and get you on their life and going about your business. Another common problem with survivors of trauma is boundaries, crossing boundaries. It's possible your client will start to ask personal questions, try to treat you like a friend rather than more of a professional relationship that goes on. They might call you several times a day or ask you for personal advice or really kind of pry into your personal life. That's not an uncommon thing. It's just really important for lawyers to set up clear boundaries about what's appropriate and what's not. And part of that is for our own selves. When we have kind of wishy-washy boundaries, when it's not clear, are you a friend or you a lawyer, we start to have to find ways to protect ourselves. And two things that's common for caregivers to do is to either rescue or judge. So it might be that I'm going to rescue and I'm going to do things I shouldn't do. Things like promising or helping with finances or other personal things that are not appropriate for a lawyer to do. So things that are over and above what a lawyer should do, that's rescuing, doing too much. On the other hand, it's judgment, right? Sometimes we need to distance ourselves from the pain that someone's feeling. And one way that we can do that very, very subconsciously is we start to judge and say, well, that couldn't happen to me because I didn't do those things. I wasn't vulnerable like that person. And there's no place in your representation for the judgment or the rescuing. So client-centered advocacy is the most important piece. Don't become the next person who's controlling the victim in their lives. They've been controlled long enough, and it's our job as lawyers to empower them. Let them take the next steps. So when we're giving options, when we're giving advice, don't tell your client what to do. Give the options. You got A, B, or C. These are the outcomes. These are the possible outcomes. These are the risks. And let the client make those decisions on their own. This is the first step. It may be the first time that they're starting to take power back for themselves. And we can really help make a difference when we do this. Also important to share those non-judgmental statements. You know, the judge may feel this way about this thing. It's not about judgment. It's not about my feeling, but you should know it so you can plan going forward and take that into account when you decide what you're going to do. You can't prepare enough with a survivor of trauma. So prepare what's going to happen. Explain. This is what the process from the very beginning to the very end is going to look like. And have that conversation on a pretty regular basis. Team up. Team up with a mental health professional to the extent that you can so that they can help your client process all the things that are going on. Prepare for what's going to happen in any given circumstance. Maybe it's a deposition. Maybe it's a motion hearing. Maybe your client is going to give testimony. Talk about what's going to happen in the court, whether it's virtual or in person, and what that is going to look like, and what you're going to do if your client is triggered. If they're telling a story that involves their traumatic experience, the chances are very high they're going to be triggered. What are you going to do? That's where you're bringing in your mental health professional to help you sort through all those things that are inevitable. How will you deal with those things that come up? And finally, planning for safety. If you're going to go to court and it's in person, how does your client get to the courthouse? Who's with them the whole time that they're at the courthouse? And how do they get back home safely? Going back and forth to court can be a very dangerous and terrifying experience for a survivor of trauma, so take that element out of it and plan around it. So as I mentioned, mental health professionals can have a huge impact on your representation. From helping your client sort through their story and be able to tell you in a more cohesive way, helping them play out all the different options, all the different implications for their own personal life, and knowing when and how to plan for the inevitable triggers. So having a mental health professional couldn't be more important. Lawyers can be empathetic and caring, but we're not trained as mental health professionals, and we shouldn't try to play one when we're doing this representation. And finally, you will make a difference in someone's life when you're representing a survivor of trauma. You will change things. Even if all you do is represent them in a small legal matter, it makes a difference. It's getting them on their way to taking back the power of their own lives. So thank you. Thank you so much for doing this on behalf of Joseph Project.